Hi, everybody. Welcome to our first lecture, this case on Ukrainian history. And just like you guys are in the process of learning this class, your professor, that's me, is doing the same thing. So if you would have asked me in the past about Ukrainian history, even though I've studied European history quite a bit, honestly, it probably would have been a fairly short conversation. Ukrainian history bubbled up quite a bit in World War II, and I studied World War II, and some other time periods. But honestly, I probably could not have said a lot. Probably most of the world could not have, unless you're a Ukrainian, of course. And that's an important story, and certainly the events of the recent year, and the terrible Russian invasion of Ukraine and attempting to crush its nationhood has brought Ukraine front and center to the world's attention, as it should. And so, starting last spring, I've embarked on trying to study and learn Ukrainian history in a much more serious way than I ever had before. It's fascinating. I'm so glad this happened. Not the terrible trauma Ukraine has had to endure and continue to endure, but just discovering a wonderful, deep, profound culture and its struggle. And it has a lot to say about our class, 20th century Europe and into the 21st century. It's an ongoing, emerging story, and a lot of the things we'll talk about in Ukrainian history will resonate and echo in the larger topics that form the time period of our class and continue to resonate and play a significant role today. It is a work in progress, so this lecture I just finished working on a few minutes ago, and I'd like to do more, but I need to get it out to you guys. So I had to stop myself, and I'll get to sources here in just a little bit, but let's go ahead and jump in. So grab a pen and pencil. But I'll try to help you guys. So when there's something really important, I'll try to highlight that for you guys to let you know this is really important. Make sure you guys write this down. If it's not highlighted, frequently you don't need to, as a practical level, write that down. It's important context and background. But focus especially on what is highlighted. That'll be on what's on the exams and help you focus on the most important takeaways from this lecture. So, all right, so sit in, buckle down, get a piece of paper or laptop, whatever handy for you guys, and let's go. And you can see in front of you Independence column in downtown Kyiv, which is the capital of Ukraine, and this statue. And but let me stop for just a minute. There are many Ukrainian names that I will do my best to pronounce. Thank you, YouTube, and other sources. I can hear from scholars and Ukrainians trying to give correct pronunciation. But there'll be sometimes when I'm going to fall short, so please forgive me. I do not speak Ukrainian. I do not read Ukrainian. This is a work in progress, so I will do my best. So anyways, back to the Independence column. This is in the Maidan Square in downtown Kyiv. This is erected after Ukrainian independence in 1991. And this figure, kind of goddess-like figure, is a kind of emblematic symbol of Ukrainian freedom. And you can see the Ukrainian blue and yellow flag there in the foreground. Now, it's a wonderful image of really all Ukrainian history, but at this moment especially, of Ukraine fighting, battling for its freedom, for its nationhood, for its culture, and for its people in this very moment as you are listening to this lecture. Again, coming to the world's attention is the fact that Ukraine is struggling for its very survival. The current invasion of Ukraine by Putin and his allies is designed to overwhelm Ukraine and bring Ukraine into the Russian imperial orbit in one manner or another. Now, Putin's claimed various versions of exactly what he's looking for Ukraine. At times, he's denied that he's trying to add Ukraine back into some reconstructed Russian empire. At the very, very least, he wanted to install a pro-Russian puppet government in Kyiv. That would have meant, of course, the death or the Ukrainian leadership fleeing the country, and Ukraine's aspirations for independence and for Ukrainian independent nationhood would have been crushed. Whatever version Putin wanted, that was certainly his goal. And you can see these Ukrainians rallying early in the war saying no. Again, there's another look at that pillar you guys saw on that first page of the notes. there in the very large square in downtown Kyiv. And again, more on just do it, support Ukraine, fight for democracy. And again, a lot of the issues we see playing out in Ukraine are going to echo back in time throughout the 20th century of other European nations also fighting for the very survival and what it means to be a citizen of that nation, what it means to be an ethnic minority, religious minority within that nation, what does it mean to have your own culture, your own self-determination, your free choice to embrace the freedoms or liberalisms, individuality and rights that your nation is aspiring to. And of course, in the 20th century, we'll see that contest over and over again. All right. So sources on Ukrainian history, and I'll explain where I'm getting my information for it too. So the first one, the Gates of Europe, the history of Ukraine, right there, has been my most important source material for these lectures on Ukrainian history. Ukrainian history is deep, it's complicated, it's a long story. Ukrainian history goes way back into the era of ancient Greece, even the earliest recorded history, frankly. It goes that far back. So if you guys are curious and want to know more, I know you guys are busy, but if you want to know more about Ukrainian history, I highly recommend, this is the best book out there by far. So I recommend The Gates of Europe, The History of Ukraine by Serhii Polky. So that'd be a great place to start. That next book there, Bloodlands, is not specifically, by the way, of course, just on Ukraine, but all of Eastern Europe. You see a subtitle there, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin by Timothy Snyder. But he will certainly address Ukraine in a broader context, in this case, what's taken place between World War I and World War II. That book in the next one by Anne Applebaum, who's an outstanding scholar and very knowledgeable about Ukrainian history, is called Red Famine, Stalin's War on Ukraine. That's a very tragic story, what's called the Holodomor. You guys are all familiar with the Holocaust, of course. Perhaps others of you are not so familiar with another, it's a genocide, frankly, called the Holodomor, which is Stalin's intentional artificial famine he imposed upon Ukraine in the 1930s. Probably anywhere from 2 to 3 million Ukrainians starved to death. That was not by accident. It didn't have to go down that way. It's intentional. And next week, by the way, your readings, you'll read some experts, some just devastating experts about people witnessing what that was like in Ukraine in that time period. The book there on the right, The Ukrainian Night by Marcy Shore, is also very good. And that is focused on much more recent Ukrainian history. In this case, the second Maidan event. And we'll talk about that more with a later lecture, not in this lecture, but that's much more, again, Ukraine in the last, since independence, like 91, has gone through a series, not just one, a series of very dramatic turning points in its just fairly recent history on would it become a free independent nation, or would it somehow be a satellite within the Soviet system, or outright absorbed by Russia? What would that look like? And that book is examining, in this case, the second Maidan uprising, which we'll talk about in a later lecture. A few more books there. Borderland by Anne Reid, again, talking about Ukraine and Russia. Obviously, that's a very fraught relationship and a complicated one. And the book there on the right, Red Cavalry by Isaac Babel. Isaac Babel is a Ukrainian Russian. When I say Russian, again, that's kind of complicated. But born in Ukrainian, probably identifies Ukrainian, but he lived during the Russia era when you're absorbed into the Russian sphere. And talking about the life under Russian control, being in the Russian army fighting the Poles, but being Ukraine at the same time period, what Ukraine was like under Russian control or empire. What is the fate of Jews? Isaac Babel's Jew. Isaac Babel's book is probably the most important literature of a little-known war in the West, and I put myself in that category too, which is the Russo-Polish War, which took place after World War I. Again, maybe even history majors may or may not be familiar with that war in 1919, 1920, in that era. And Isaac Babel writing about that and just and what that meant for the Jewish community in the area, oftentimes victimized, sometimes massacred. Isaac Babel would ultimately be killed in one of Stalin's purges as a Ukrainian dissident writer. And there's more. Now, I have some recommendation for you guys here at the start of the lecture. So, and I've been using this whole past fall too. Now, honestly, Ukrainian studies is very new inside the United States. I believe, don't quote me on this, but I believe there's only 2 academic programs in the United States on Ukrainian history. 2 universities are offering standalone Ukrainian history classes, although perhaps that's expanded. But the good news is one of our more outstanding American history professors, Timothy Snyder, you see him right here, there's Dr. Snyder. Timothy Snyder of Yale University has very kindly and wonderfully filmed his Ukrainian history course on YouTube this past fall. It's all on YouTube. That has been, I gotta be honest, that's been invaluable to this guy right here. Now, he goes in much, much more detail, gets an entire semester focusing on Ukrainian history in all its complexity, and then also giving the larger. He does a very good job of focusing on Ukrainian history, but also giving the larger story, because the larger story is complex. Ukraine is in a very complicated neighborhood surrounded by oftentimes more powerful empires and nations around them, and Ukraine oftentimes almost lost in the shuffle between these great empires and kingdoms. But he has an outstanding lecture. I recommend it to you guys. It's on YouTube. Just put in Professor Timothy Snyder, Yale University, History of Ukraine. I think there's 27, 28 lectures, something like that. They're wonderful. So if you guys, if your interest is piqued by Ukraine, what's taking place, and the videos I've assigned for class also help you get a little more sense of what we're talking about, and be inspired to dig more in Ukraine history, and you want to know more beyond my relatively short work in construction lectures, which I'm making for this class, you want to know more, Professor Snyder's YouTube courses, again, that's on YouTube. It's free. You guys need to log on, to put in Timothy Snyder, History of Ukraine, and start with lecture 1 and start working your way. They're fabulous. He's a very good lecturer, and he'll go into whole levels deeper complexity analysis that we can afford to do, because we're doing 20th century Europe, we're doing all of Europe. So we unfortunately cannot spend too long on just Ukraine, although I wanted to start our class with Ukraine. Timothy Snyder also has a bestseller and a wonderful book. It's quite short, called On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. Timothy Snyder has been quite alarmed by recent events and challenges to democracy in the United States and other places in the last probably 6, 7, 8 years. Been quite concerned that some of the pillars of our democracy, truth, due process, separation of powers, the power of the media, the loose use of language, all kinds of things, by the way, which are going to be echoed very, very well by Thomas Rick's book, Churchill and Orwell. Many of the core themes of Churchill and Orwell battling in the 30s and 40s are going to be echoed by Timothy Snyder in a short read on Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century, about how people lose their freedoms and their democracy. It's very timely. I recommend that small book to you guys on tyranny. It's not a long read. It's wonderful to help shore up, as educated citizens, our democracy. Many of you guys in this class are future historians. So part of our job as historians is a moral conscience with a memory. Not that we don't have humility, that our perspectives are limited. We don't claim to have any superior wisdom, but hopefully we do have access to a greater perspective and longitudinal view of what has taken place over time that often our fellow citizens don't have. And that's part of our moral responsibility to our fellow citizens, is to bring that perspective, that knowledge, and make it of use for our democracy today in a protective measure. I mentioned he wrote Bloodlands years ago. I would not be surprised if he's not working on a book on Ukraine currently. We're going to have to wait, and it's not going to come out in our class, I think. Although, who knows? I would not be surprised at all. I bet he is. But in any case, Bloodlands, again, that's not just in Ukraine history. That's all of Europe between World War I and World War II, and not so well known here in the West, but we have a very good introduction for you guys. And then Marcy Shore, I mentioned her briefly. She's a specialist in Eastern Europe, especially Poland, but is very familiar with Ukraine and is quite intimately involved in Ukraine, has Ukrainian friends. And following events in Maidan Square in 2014 to 2015, felt that she had to respond, and she wrote Ukrainian Night, which would be a wonderful read if you want to get deeper into contemporary, well, nearly contemporary Ukrainian history and their ongoing battle for nationhood and freedom against encroaching corruption and, above all, Russia's Putin's tentacles trying to seize control of Ukraine and pull it into a new Russian reconstructed empire. Now, I'm trying to watch the clock here. So, now Ukrainian history is complicated. If you listen to some of Russian state media, which would be interesting, not very truthful, but certainly interesting, you would hear over and over again, Ukraine has never been an independent people, that Ukraine shares a common history with Russia, that really Ukraine is simply a part of Russia. We have the same ancestors. Ukrainian nationhood is a lie. It's not real. Ukraine has always been, except for some exceptions, really a part of Russia. In fact, they refer to it as Little Russia. Now, there is, and I would say this carefully, there is some elements of truth to some of that. And that's as a historian, right? We have to be comfortable with complexity. In elementary school and junior high, we can be comfortable with simple black and white. In academia, though, we have to get comfortable with some complexity and sometimes some nuance, sometimes even some different, discomforting complexity. And that's certainly the case with Ukrainian history. So, it is true that both Ukraine and Russia will claim the same common ancestors, in this case, Kievan Rus, which we'll get to here in a little bit. But Kievan Rus, just in a short introduction, was a state that was headed in the city of Kiev. The Russians might say Kiev, but the Ukrainians Kiev, and also included today parts of what would be, besides Ukraine, also parts of Belarus and parts of today what we would term portions of Western Russia. So both Russians and Ukrainians, looking back to their earliest sense of who they are as a people, both point to the same ancestors. In this case, you can see the pronunciation a little bit different than the two. Vladimir the Great, that's him depicted right there. And that's a Russian monument, by the way. So this is a symbol of, he's one of our first Christian rulers in the kingdom of Kievan Rus. And you see him holding the cross there. Now, the Ukrainians called him Vladimir. Same man, just a pronunciation in the Ukrainian language. Also, same deal. He's one of our great early Christian rulers when we are becoming an ancestor to our people. The monument there is also there again to Vladimir, same guy, but that one's in Russia. And on the right, this one is in Ukraine today. Same guy, different spelling of his name, different pronunciation, but same guy, both claim. And back up here, what you look at here, this is Uruk. So the Kievan Rus, according to historians, our best understanding, is actually founded by Vikings. Maybe surprised you guys. But the origin of the first Ukrainian/Russian or Belarusian state is actually a Viking, or has a Viking origin. Now, there are probably Slavs in that area already living there, but the Vikings come down from the north, and they come down the rivers there, and they're the ones who initially set up and stabilized this brand new state, which we refer to as Kievan Rus. And again, because the Vikings are even older Vikings in this time period, they're not Christian. Those Vikings are going to be the founders of Kievan Rus. Later on, you'd have a Vladimir or Vladimir, the Ukrainian version, who would Christianize and extend the Kievan Rus to close to its height of power. Complicated factor, Russians and Ukrainians, Belarusians all claim those guys. The Viking ancestors who first got the state started, and later on, they're great kings who converted Christianity and became a Christian kingdom. For example, that's Vladimir, and that is on the Ukrainian money from 2006. Now, I mentioned it complicated, and I want to show you something quickly here because perhaps Putin might like that first part of my lecture where I mentioned they have a common ancestor. That is true. but bear with me for a second. So look carefully here if you guys see really closely here. So this map shows Russian territorial expansion. It begins in 1300. You guys see that's important. The Russian state, as you know it now, again, it claims an older ancestor. But Russia, as we know it, really its origin is when it springs free from Mongol control, which we'll get to later. In any case, that's in the 1300s. At that time, if you look really closely, notice this is the Russian lands at its very earliest. Again, they would claim earlier ancestors, but the Russian nation we know today really has its beginning with the pushing out of the Mongols who had conquered Russia. And that would be in the 1300s. Now notice carefully, that's this region right here. That is not Ukraine. Ukraine is here. Do you see that? So the beginning of the modern Russian state that you and I know does not begin controlling Ukrainian land. It's in this region right here. Now gradually it'll grow and grow and grow. As you guys see all the way to the Pacific coast, begins to absorb parts of the Ottoman Empire and Central Asian Republic. If you look really closely though, this area in purple, is that violet? You can choose a color you feel comfortable with. Purple, violet. This color is not added to the Russian imperial project until you guys see into the 1600s or early 1700s. That'd be under Catherine the Great. So geographic Ukraine being added into the Russian Empire, which they refer to as Little Russia, does not take place until a little bit in the 1600s, but really into the 1700s under Queen Catherine, Tsarina of Russia, and she's the one. Now that's really important to know because that's certainly how the Ukrainians feel too, which is, yeah, we have some common ancestors, but there's a major parting of the road, and Russia's only real claim to us has come about in more recent, well, since 1700s, and that's because military conquest, not because we were just waiting and pining for Russia to take us back home into Mother Russia. By the way, Kievan Rus is way older than the Russian polity we're talking about right here, right? So that's a little background. That's that monument there today in Russia showing all these various Ukrainian ancestors. That's Vladimir right there, and that's Rurik. He's the Vikings who founded the Kievan state of Rus. Now in Russia, they add them all together with later Russian heroes too. That's their national story. Now then, Ukrainians, you would agree with these two guys right here on your Ukrainian monument, but a lot of the rest of these you'd reject and say, yeah, those are Russians, that's fine for you guys, but those are not Ukrainians. So yeah, we have these some common ancestors, but then our rivers parted. All right. Now let me give you just a little bit of overview of Ukrainian history here. So Ukraine, I mentioned, has a complicated history, and I'm not going to try to get you guys to get too lost in that complexity. Some topics we have to kind of browse briefly over before we move on. But here, let me highlight this for you guys. Oops, hold on. There we go. I mentioned highlighting. The Ukrainian land and people occupy a very fertile land. Ukraine, from all recorded history, has had, the area of Ukraine has exceptionally productive farmland. In many ways, oftentimes the best in Eastern Europe. Some other places are pretty good too, but Ukraine has always, we're talking about all the way to the ancient Greek world, been known for its outstanding agricultural output. It's one of the breadbaskets. Just like the Central Valley here in California, we're in a breadbasket, right? Ukraine is also a breadbasket. Very productive farmland. It's been fought over and won at less over by many empires because it is so productive. Now, because of that, Ukraine oftentimes has been a borderland between other more powerful empires who want something or compete with other empires, and Ukraine is often squeezed or caught in the middle. And frankly, there's been not many times in human history where if you froze that moment in time, you looked at a world map where you'd find what we today understand as a Ukrainian state on the map. So Ukraine as an independent, sovereign, free nation has really only existed a few times when it was really its own free location. Now, as a people and as a complex culture and region, it's always been there. But to be free, and the Ukrainian people can make their own sovereign choices, what they want to do, what is their destiny, both individually and as a nation. That's only happened a few times in all history. Again, that's one reason why Putin and some others have tried to say Ukraine has no independent history, either really just simply part of Russia and always have been, which is a lie. And it's a gross oversimplification of the complexity of history. But there are a few important moments I want you guys to know about. So here, let's move on here. But we'll come back to these pictures here in just a minute. So I mentioned Ukraine being exceptionally good farmland and a quite large region, by the way. Ukraine is not a small place. Ukraine is, it's the second largest Eastern European nation currently. We're talking currently since 1991, but the second largest. Also has a quite large population, which, by the way, is one reason why I'd probably be able to survive fighting against Russia right now. Other reasons too. But they're not a small country, and nor do they have a small population. Now, they're certainly much smaller than Russia, but they're not a small country. But almost all their history, they have been a meeting place of other empires fighting for control of all kinds of groups. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Ottoman Turks, the Habsburg dynasty, the Russian Empire, and many others I didn't even mention there. So, and here we go. So what do you guys, I want you guys to know from that. So here, let me highlight this for you guys and give you guys a minute to write this down. And I can make that bigger for you guys. Is that better? Okay, there you go. So for most of what we would term Ukrainian history, our modern nationalist vision of Ukrainian people nation did not exist as a recognized independent nation. Again, it didn't mean they have aspirations to be one, but that they just simply were not able to exist. Despite many aspirations to make that happen, but to be a free, independent Ukrainian nation for most of history was not something that's possible for them. But if you want to choose some moments in time, so what is the core through line of Ukrainian identity and the aspirations for it to be a people, I'll mention a couple of those. Of course, one is the founding story of Kievan Rus. And we'll get to them in a little bit. Let me highlight that for you guys. And I mentioned already that's a little complicated because Russians also claim that. That's fine. That's fine. We don't need to worry about that's not true. No, it's true. Both sides claim that, and the Belarusians also claim that. But the Mongols will bring that to an end. What happened to Kievan Rus? The Mongols. The Mongols, as they did to many peoples and nations, civilizations in Asia, into the Middle East and Europe, the Mongols brought devastation, and the Mongols will bring the Kievan state to an end. The next really moment in time when it appears that perhaps the Ukrainians will emerge as free independent people would be under the Ukrainian Cossack state, called the Hetman or Zaporizhian host. And you can see the years up there. Now, technically, they're not independent in those years. You see, it's about 100 years, and they're not independent. The Ukrainians at time period, they're there because there are very important nationalist aspirations during that 100-year window in time under the Cossacks. But the Cossacks are not really, they're not a free, independent people. They're competent great powers. We'll get to that topic with a later lecture. But certainly their aspirations, though, is if possible, we would certainly like to be free. And they do have a certain level of autonomy. They're not completely free and sovereign, but they do have, during the 100-year time period, there's a certain degree of where Ukrainian identity is forming and solidifying of we want to be an independent people. Now, it's not going to happen for them. The Russians, why did it end in 1764? Catherine the Great. The Russian Tsarina, she's going to bring that to an end because of Russian power and arms. But it's not because the Ukrainian Cossacks gave up the wish for their independent nationhood. It's just simply they could not resist any longer. And then we get to the modern era, and there are a couple of these Ukrainian People's Republic. And you see a few years there are separated, starting in 1917. And these obviously didn't work. They attempted. This is in the chaos and dislocation of World War I. The Ukrainians are hoping in all that chaos of the war that perhaps now we can have a state. And they try to have one. And they sort of temporarily begin to set one up. But in the chaos end of World War I, combined with the Bolshevik or Communist Revolution in Russia, it's not going to last, and it'll be taken into the Russian Empire again. Until, of course, today's free and independent Ukraine, which broke away from the Soviet Union in the fall of of the Iron Curtain in Russia in 1991. And so, really from Kievan Rus till today, this is the only time when they've been, I'd say, truly free and independent. Although even that, as you guys know, has not been entirely that simple. Russia has steadily attempted to exert control. Even from the beginnings of their independence, Russia was very reluctant, to say the least, to allow Ukraine to go their independent way. And that battle continues. It's not over yet. So that, stay tuned, because that story continues to play out. All right. So, Ukrainian historian Serhiy Polky, and I mentioned him before with his excellent book, which is right there, writes in his History of the Gates of Europe, Ukrainian culture has always existed in a shared space with other cultures and early involved navigating among others. Think larger empires and peoples around them. The ability of Ukrainian society to cross inner and outer frontiers and negotiate identities created by them constitutes a main characteristic of the history of Ukraine. It's complicated. How do you, as a Ukrainian, through all these several thousand years, frankly, how do you maintain some kind of sense of who you are in the midst, oftentimes, of a larger empire controlling you? And again, that means complicated. It means a lot of cultural complexity in Ukraine, and even some complexity of Ukraine, how you navigate that while still being, again, our modern conception of Ukrainian, but oftentimes under various other empires that control you, and what does that look like? Okay. So I want to give you an example of this, and we're not going to go too much farther in this lecture, but this is an important one. So we're going to talk about probably the single most important founder of Ukrainian sense of nationhood and language, and that is Taras Shevchenko. And I hope I pronounce his name. It's close to that. So forgive me if you on YouTube would hear a slightly different pronunciation, but I believe Taras Shevchenko is pretty close. Now, who is this guy? What is his significance? And by the way, make sure you take good notes on this because it's absolutely going to be on the exam. So, and by the way, help you guys out. Let me help you guys out. There we go. Let me highlight this for you guys. So Taras Shevchenko is Ukraine's most important poet, writer, and artist. He plays a critical role in Ukraine's fight for nationhood, symbolically in other ways, but explicitly because he's considered the father of modern Ukrainian literature and Ukrainian language, and that is so important in the project of nationhood and forming a national identity, to have your own language, your own culture, and someone reflecting that national cultural ethos of who you are as a people, especially when you're trying to be subsumed, forced within a Russian empire, which is trying to deny you those very things. For example, suppressing the Ukrainian language, suppressing any kind of Ukrainian indigenous culture or identity, and trying to simply swallow and absorb you into a larger kind of pan-Russian empire philosophy. And Taras living under this, but rebelling on this, and his art and his brilliance and his voice resonated powerfully in his own lifetime and down to today. Now, I'm talking currently right now. Check your watch what time it is. That's ongoing. And let me give you some examples. I mentioned him being a great poet and artist. There we go. Ukraine, oh my dear Ukraine, trampled by the Poles. Now, by the way, he's talking about earlier Ukrainian history when Ukraine will be controlled by the Polish-Lithuanian Empire. And that time period, again, the Ukrainians we think of today are under Polish-Lithuanian control. And the Polish control would extend all the way, in some forms or another, almost into the 20th century too. Although Russia could play a much bigger role in that case. But having a sense of the Poles in an earlier time period suppressing Ukrainian identity and culture. Yes, trampled by the Poles, my dearest, when I think of you, my homeland, my heart can only cry. This right here is a monument in Lviv, Ukrainian history. This would be in western Ukraine. And you see Taras right there, and a kind of symbol of early, again, kind of symbol of Ukrainian nation independence there, with this kind of goddess-like figure there, and that figure there of Taras Shevchenko. There's a lifetime he lived from 1814 to 1861. He's a Ukrainian poet. In fact, here, this is important for you guys. By the way, thank you, Wikipedia. I had to be honest where I got this from. Shevchenko was a Ukrainian poet, writer, artist, public and political figure, folklorist, ethnographer. So even more important right here, his literary heritage regarded as foundation of modern Ukrainian literature and to a large extent modern Ukrainian language. Again, this is a language that Russia is trying to forbid and suppress. One of the ways, by the way, a colonizing power, imperial power, tries to deal with the occupied people is to eliminate aspects of any identity they have that is not part of this larger colonial imperial culture. So in this case, Ukrainian language. So the Russians in this time period are trying to suppress the Ukrainian language and hopefully to drive it out of existence and say there is no separate Ukrainian language. There is no Ukraine. There simply is us, the larger Russian Empire. I mentioned him being a very talented artist. This guy was, I was going to say Bo Jackson of the arts, but you guys probably know who Bo Jackson is, so I was probably too old. He was, when I was in college, he was a superstar athlete. He could play baseball great, played for the Oakland Raiders, an extraordinarily talented athlete playing both sports simultaneously, baseball and football. I don't mean simultaneously. He could go seasons back and forth, but just an exceptional athlete. Well, that is Taras Shevchenko. So he's an extraordinary painter, poet, and writer. I suppose, above all, it's his poetry and his writing that's more significant than his artistry as a painter. He's a very talented painter. Down on the left is a self-portrait he did as a relatively young man.